Have I ever told you about Eddie Chapman, Agent Zigzag? His is one of the great World War II spy stories. Born in England in 1914, Chapman did a brief stint with the British Army and then turned to crime, becoming a professional safecracker. In 1939, he was arrested on the island of Jersey and sentenced to prison. Oh, hold on a second. There we go. While there, World War II broke out, and the Germans seized the Channel Islands, including Jersey. They released him and then arrested him for further crimes, and then sent him to prison in France. But he offered to work for the Nazis, who trained him in explosives, radio communications, and parachute jumping. In late 1942, he was dropped into England on a mission to blow up a de Havilland aircraft factory. Instead, Chapman turned himself in and offered to work with the British intelligence agency, MI5. MI5 was skeptical. Where did this man's allegiance lie? Was he a double agent or a triple agent, serving the British or the Germans? They finally took him up on his offer, giving him the code name Zigzag. They faked an attack on the factory that tricked the Germans into thinking Chapman had done what he was sent for. When he returned to Germany, the Germans awarded him a medal. Then in 1944, Chapman parachuted into England again, this time on a mission to let the Germans know whether their V-1 and V-2 rockets were reaching their targets. Instead, he gave the Nazis misleading information, causing them to redirect the attacks to less populated areas, saving numerous lives in central London. After the war, Chapman went back into smuggling gold. He ran a health spa, did many other things. Yet even though he was a lifelong crook, he had enough integrity to serve his country, not the Germans. An MI5 officer who knew him said, the Germans came to love Chapman, but although he went cynically through all the forms, he did not reciprocate. He knew where his allegiance was. Now, toward the end of today's text, Jesus says, no servant can serve two masters. For either he will hate the one and love the other, or he will be devoted to the one and despise the other. You cannot serve God and money. Eddie Chapman, despite the lip service he gave to Germany, did not serve two masters. Unless, of course, you count himself. I mean, he did put himself first, but not at the expense of England. Which shows that not only can't you serve two masters, but that using a criminal as your example makes your point a little more difficult to understand. Yet Jesus not only taught this principle, but he used a criminal, at least a dishonest person, in the parable that leads to this principle. As a result, this parable, Luke 16, is widely regarded as one of the most difficult of all the parables. Still, the overall teaching of the passage remains pretty clear, that our attitude toward money is a litmus test of our attitude toward God. As I showed the kids, litmus solution, litmus paper is a sure test of acidity. In the same way, this parable and these principles show that how you handle money is a sure test of the priority God has in your life. The parable shows that we can use wealth so that others see God's mercy. The principles show that we can put God first. As we examine our attitude toward money, we learn something about our relationship with God. Let's start with the parable, chapter 16, verses 1 to 9. He also said to the disciples, there was a rich man who had a manager, and charges were brought to him that this man was wasting his possessions. And he called him and said to him, what is this that I hear about you? Turn in the account of your management, for you can no longer be manager. And the manager said to himself, what shall I do? Since my master is taking the management away from me, I'm not strong enough to dig. Hey, Todd, I'm not strong enough to dig, and I'm ashamed to beg. I have decided what to do, so that when I am removed from my management, people will receive me into their houses. So summoning his master's debtors one by one, he said to the first, "How much do you owe my master?" He said, 100 measures of oil. He said to him, "Take your bill and sit down quickly and write 50. Then he said to another, "And how much do you owe?" He said, 100 measures of wheat. He said to him, "Take your bill and write 80. The master commended the dishonest manager for his shrewdness. For the sons of this world are more shrewd in dealing with their own generation than the sons of light. And I tell you, make friends for yourselves by means of unrighteous wealth, so that when it fails, they may receive you into the eternal dwellings." All right, so remember context. This is the fourth in a series of parables in chapters 15 and 16. The first three were the lost sheep, the lost coin, and the prodigal son. They each showed that God's gracious love seeks lost sinners. I believe this parable, though more difficult, is still about God's mercy. Yet it is also about how we act with our money, using it to show others God's mercy. The story itself is simple. There is a rich man who has a manager or a steward. Most likely the rich man is a landowner, and the steward manages his dealings with those who rent the land. The landowner finds out that the steward has wasted his possessions, misused his position for personal pleasure. In our day, this would be like a politician using tax dollars to fly to New York for a haircut, or taking bribes to give a certain company contracts, some kind of scandal that results in personal gain. So the landowner says, "Go and get your books and hand them in. You can't be my manager anymore." That's not shocking to us, but Kenneth Bailey, who wrote 2 extraordinary books on the parables of Jesus, makes the acute observation that in simply firing this manager, the landowner is showing extreme mercy. We know this from other parables and accounts in the Gospels. For example, in the parable of the unforgiving servant, Matthew 18, the master says, "You wicked servant, I forgave you all that debt because you pleaded with me, and should you not have had mercy on your fellow servant, as I had mercy on you?" And in his anger, his master delivered him to the jailers until he should pay all his debt. Even more extreme penalties are seen elsewhere. In Luke 12, the servant says, "My master is delayed in coming," and he begins to beat the male and female servants and to eat and drink and get drunk. The master of that servant will come on a day when he does not expect him and will cut him in pieces and put him with the unfaithful. The point is that to simply fire this steward is an act of extreme mercy. Bailey says that to Jesus' listeners, this mercy would have been the most striking element of the early part of this parable. And that impacts how this man finds a way to provide for himself when he's fired. He knows he's going to be broke, unable to provide. He says, "I'm too weak for physical labor. I would be ashamed to beg," which was something that was despised in Israel. And then he gets an idea. You almost see the light bulb go on quickly. Before even going back to his master with the account books, he calls in the people who are renting land and begins to write off their rent payments. One man who rents olive groves at a cost of 800 gallons of olive oil per season, he cuts that down to 400 gallons. For another man who grows wheat on the land, he cuts the rental price from 1,000 to 800 bushels of the wheat harvest. And we're led to assume he did the same thing for many other renters. Now, why did this manager in this time of crisis choose this method to assure his future? Okay, recognize first of all that this is a dishonest manager. Look at how the parable ends. The master commended the dishonest manager because he had acted shrewdly. He is dishonest, that's a given. But as one commentator says, there's a big difference between the master commended the dishonest manager because he had acted shrewdly, and the master commended the shrewd manager because he had acted dishonestly. He's not commended for his dishonesty. So let's think about what he did, actually. He marked down the amount these debtors would owe the rich man. He reduced their rent. Apparently, he did so without asking for any bribe or compensation, simply letting on that he had seen maybe the way the growing season was going. He talked the rich man into accepting a lower amount. And I believe he showed what we might call godly prudence in doing it this way. I mean, there's no question he could have gotten money some other way. He could have accepted bribes or coerced them by threatening to evict these people, but instead, he does something that gains their good will. The really clever part is that his master won't do a thing about it, because the manager creates goodwill not only for himself, but also for the rich man. He's put the rich man in a position where he'd be ashamed to lose his image of generosity by setting the bills back to where they were supposed to have been. It's a clever scheme. It's a dishonest scheme, but it creates goodwill and good opinion, and, don't miss this, it depends entirely on the merciful and generous nature of the rich man. And he's proven right. The rich man doesn't contradict him, but rather commends him for his cleverness. Now, because this is a hard parable, commentators have some other theories about the steward's scheme. Some say that the amount he reduced the bills by was the interest, and since they weren't supposed to charge interest in the first place, the master couldn't say anything about it. Others say that the steward was only reducing the debts by his share, the agent's fee for these renters. But if so, why is he called a dishonest steward? That would not have been a dishonest activity. So Jesus is commending the steward for the way his dishonesty, which he doesn't commend, led him to generosity toward others and amplified the already established generosity of his master. So it's like Eddie Chapman. He was a criminal, and you would not approve of his criminal activities if you read about them in detail. But we do approve of the shrewd way he used criminal skills to fool the Germans, to show unintended mercy to people who would otherwise have been killed by their V-1 and V-2 rockets. So how does this apply to us? Verses 8 and 9. The master commended his dishonest manager for his shrewdness, for the sons of the world are more shrewd in dealing with their own generation than the sons of light. And I tell you, make friends for yourself by means of unrighteous wealth, so that when it fails, they may receive you into eternal dwellings. The people of the world, he's saying, deal shrewdly in their own realm. They sometimes even use godly prudence, like this manager, but in a dishonest way. Even more, the people of the light, believers, I think, those who know God, should use godly prudence, honesty, in dealing with money. If we take our example from the parable, that our action should be to use our money, to use our wealth, not to directly benefit ourselves, but to bring honor and goodwill to the Master, to the Lord, to God himself. Do you see what I'm saying? The parable teaches, and Jesus affirms, that we ought to use our wealth to allow others to see the goodness and graciousness of God. But how do we do that in practical terms? I mean, there are many here who would say, I don't have any wealth. I'm barely scraping by. How am I supposed to use wisely what I don't have? How can I show God's goodness? Well, there are two answers. One of them is that giving is founded on our allegiance, not on our ability. If you make God your first priority, you will find ways to give. Jesus addresses this in the principles that follow. But second, many of us are not using money as wisely as we could. We're not managing our own costs well. We're using money in wasteful ways, or we're giving haphazardly and not always to the right things. We talked about this earlier this year when we studied stewardship. The principles Jesus gives here reinforce that. So, assuming we have the allegiance and some ability to give money or time or energy, what actions can we take to allow others to see the goodness and graciousness of God? Simple answer. Do something or fund something that shows God's love in a practical way to those in need. When I was in high school, many years ago, we supported Project Concern, which brought health and nutrition help in the U.S. and around the world. I've never forgotten the moment in one of their videos where a child who received dental care for the first time said, I always thought teeth was supposed to hurt. That's the kind of place, that's the place where we can show God's love in a practical way. So those of you who help with crisis response over these last 2 years, those of you who've come to the community dinners can remember homeowners saying, I can't believe y'all would do these things. To be the hands and feet and heart and voice of Jesus shows his incredible mercy. Again, community pregnancy centers, which offer free pregnancy tests and ultrasounds, that they do it with an ulterior motive, to save unborn lives and to share the gospel, but it's done with such extreme compassion, meeting real needs, that it shows God's love in a practical way. And it doesn't have to be even that complicated. We can show God's love in practical ways in daily life. Hospitality, which we've talked about a lot in the last few years, shows God's goodness. Use some of your money and give up some of your time to open your home to other people. You don't have to buy a big home to do this. You don't have to decorate like the White House. You don't have to take a course in etiquette. You can exercise hospitality with minimum investment of time and money. So once you've got the right allegiance toward God, once you've learned practical self-control and finances, then you can give in a way that shows God's mercy. So Jesus uses the next section to give principles for day-to-day management of money and for your attitude toward it. Verses 10 to 12, one who is faithful in a very little is also faithful in much, and one who is dishonest in a very little is also dishonest in much. If then you have not been faithful in the unrighteous wealth, who will entrust to you the true riches? And if you have not been faithful in that which is another's, who will give you that which is your own? Perhaps the most important principle in a Christian understanding of money is the one we studied last summer, stewardship. The money I have is not my own, but belongs to God and is given to me to manage. If that principle wasn't true, these verses wouldn't make sense. Verse 10 in the NIV says, whoever can be trusted with very little can also be trusted with much. That makes sense if I recognize that it is God who is entrusting me with the things I call my possessions. He looks at how I handle what he's already given me before he gives me greater things to be trusted with. But if I take what he has, what he's given me, and squander it and waste it and use it dishonestly or dishonorably or only for personal gain, then he will not trust me with much more, since that too I will probably waste. This is the litmus test that God sometimes uses. How you view and handle finances is a test of how you will handle the larger responsibilities of God's kingdom. Verse 11, if then you have not been faithful in the unrighteous wealth, who will entrust to you the true riches? The true riches, I think we could go show from Scripture, are spiritual riches, spiritual responsibilities, true knowledge, intimacy with God that leads us to invest ourselves in the care of other people's lives and in effective prayer and in witness. Those are the true riches. Verse 12, and if you have not been faithful in that which is another's, who will give you that which is your own? Or entrusted with another's property and another's riches. It's God's stuff. Although, amazingly, when you trust Jesus Christ, when you become a joint heir with him, not just a steward, but an heir of the estate, God intends then that you manage this property well, because that property, in a sense, is at least partly also your own. And how are you going to handle that? Overall, the verses call us to be faithful in day-to-day management of the resources which are really God's, but which are under your stewardship. Simple enough. Do you see it? The principle that controls our action is that we use money to show others the goodness and graciousness of God. The factor that governs the effectiveness is the day-to-day management of his resources. And this day-to-day management shows up mostly in the dreary realities of budgeting and self-control. Budgeting is making a realistic plan for your spending, and self-control is sticking to that plan. And it is those things that enable generosity. As you make your budget and as you control your expenses, you consult with the true owner and make sure that your budget meets his specific individual priorities for your life. My budget will not be the same as your budget. Your spending will not be the same as my spending. But God grant that we both manage in ways that are faithful to the true owner, that result in generosity, that show his goodness. So we won't be able to achieve day-to-day management until we've first established our allegiance. Verses 13 to 15. No servant can serve two masters. For he will either hate the one and love the other, or he will be devoted to the one and despise the other. You cannot serve God and money. The Pharisees, who were lovers of money, heard all these things, and they ridiculed him. And he said to them, you are those who justify yourselves before men, but God knows your hearts, for what is exalted among men is an abomination in the sight of God. The essential foundational question for anyone seeking to deal wisely with money or with time or with energy is, what is my first allegiance? Is it God or is it money? Jesus makes the point with this striking statement, no man can serve two masters. You cannot serve both God and money, or mammon in the older versions. Your true allegiance will always be to one or the other. As Bob Dylan said, you're going to have to serve somebody. I love the scene from one of my favorite old movies, The Ultimate Gift, where Jason is learning the value of work, and they play Dylan's song for the soundtrack.
Yes, indeed, you're gonna have to serve somebody. Serve somebody. Serve somebody. Yes, you're gonna have to serve somebody. Serve somebody. Well, it may be the devil, or it may be the Lord, but you're gonna have to serve somebody. Yeah. Serve somebody. Well, it may be the devil, and it may be the Lord, but you're gonna have to serve somebody.
This is what Jesus is saying to us. If you're not serving God, you're serving somebody, someone else, something else. If you're not serving God 24/7, 365, you're serving yourself. And for way too many of us, that manifests in the striving for money, possessions, or security. And the Pharisees couldn't handle that. They saw earthly wealth as a sign of God's blessing. But God saw in their hearts that they were enslaved to serving mammon. This is a warning to us. That this, he said, was an abomination. And it's a warning to us to examine ourselves carefully. Jesus says they justify themselves in the eyes of men. And it's so easy, especially in this area of finances, to justify ourselves, to make excuses, to convince even ourselves that our use of money is appropriate, that we have not made financial security more important than trusting God. But we cannot. We cannot, no matter how hard we try, trust both. Either our lives reflect a basic allegiance to financial security, or they reflect a basic allegiance to God. That's the foundation of all financial discussion. If I made my first allegiance God, then on that comes the ability to see my possessions of God as God's, and on that builds these actions of using the possessions to show others God's goodness and graciousness. So this is where the rubber comes fully into contact with the road, and we can begin to apply this teaching. If the first fundamental is allegiance to God, then the first question you have to answer is not, what do you do with your money? That question's meaningless. That question's out of order. The question you need to answer is, what do you do with your heart? It's a little like a caterpillar and a butterfly. I could stand over the caterpillar all day saying, fly, fly! And the caterpillar will never fly, and if he tries, it'll be a disaster. What the caterpillar needs is to be changed, to go into that cocoon and have every part changed so that he becomes the butterfly. Then flying is natural. So if I stand up here and tell you what to do with your money, but if your heart has never been changed, that's utterly useless. The core need here is a heart whose first allegiance is utterly to God. And that only comes when you put your faith and trust in Jesus. The normal person's first allegiance is himself. He or she is self-centered, self-reliant, self-interested. And money represents that self-centeredness. It represents striving for security, achievement, or power. But the Bible calls self-centeredness sin, an act of rebellion against God. It's saying me first in a universe that only works right when all created beings say God first. Jesus died to pay the penalty for this rebellion. He took on himself our sin, the separation from God that our self-centeredness creates. He took the pain, the righteous anger of God that should have been directed to us. So now when we say to him, Lord Jesus, I believe in you. I trust in what you did on the cross and in the resurrection. I trust you to rescue me from this situation, to restore me to a right relationship with God. We say that and he does it. We trust him and he saves. He creates in us a new kind of person, a person that can have God as first allegiance. Jesus himself calls this the new birth, the butterfly emerging from the cocoon and finding that he or she can fly. Paul says, if anyone is in Christ, he's a new creation. The old has passed away and the new has come. This kind of person cannot and need not serve two masters. He need not serve money, and he can serve God. With this allegiance, you and I can go on to those next two levels. The ability which he gives to live in a day-to-day way, because I see my possessions as truly God's, and then actions built on that, using what God has given to show others his extreme mercy. We can budget our money and make purchases in ways that please God. We can give generously to church, missions, local ministry, and other godly creative outlets. So the way I want you to remember this sermon is backwards. Allegiance first. That leads to the ability to give, and that leads to the actions of giving. Allegiance, ability, action. I opened the sermon with the story of Eddie Chapman, so I want to close with the story of another convicted criminal. In the 1980s, Randy Alcorn was the pastor of a church in Gresham, Oregon, and already a well-known author. In those years, Alcorn and his church participated in Operation Rescue-style nonviolent protests at abortion clinics. Alcorn says, an abortion clinic won a court judgment against a group of us, and I discovered that my church was about to receive a writ of garnishment against my wages. To prevent the church from either having to pay the clinic or to defy a court order, I resigned. I'd already divested myself of book royalties, and our family was living on only a portion of my church salary. Then another clinic was awarded the largest judgment ever against peaceful protesters, $8.2 million. By all appearances, our lives had taken a devastating turn. But it was one of the best things that happened to us. What they intended for evil, God intended for good. We began a nonprofit organization, Eternal Perspective Ministries. The only way I could avoid garnishment was to make no more than minimum wage. Royalties from my book go to EPM, which gives 100% to Christian organizations. By God's grace, we've given away more than $6 million to date, and that is now way above the $8.2 million at this point. So is that shrewd? Yeah. Yeah, you want to garnish my wages? Ha ha! I'll live on minimum wage. Does it show God's goodness? Yeah. All the money that would have come to me is going to go to help Christian organizations. Is this good stewardship of what God's given? Yeah. Has he radically made God his master and not money? Yeah. Allegiance to God is the only thing that brings the ability to give. And like Randy Alcorn, you and I can put that God-given ability into action.